Math 13 students, we have here a video for section 3.1, measures of center. This is going to get you up and running on using your TI-84 calculator. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. All right, get things ready up here. So we have section 3.1, measures of center, technical detail. Now, we're going to have a number of these videos on how to use your TI-84 calculator. It's a very hands-on process. More practice is better, and it really does help. So you're going to want to do your homework. You're going to want to look at all the videos we have. You're going to want to practice your keystrokes. You're going to need them during assessments. So, measures of center, technical detail. Bit of an outline first. We're going to learn how to enter sample data into our calculator. We'll use the V1 stats command. That's going to do all the heavy lifting to calculate our measures of center. And then we're going to identify the various measures of center that we can take off of that calculator. This is an important note. This course really does require that you obtain and use a Texas Instruments TI-84 calculator. Any model of the TI-84 is acceptable. There's a number of them out there. Any of them will do. Other models or makes are really not going to be useful for us this semester, so a TI-84 is absolutely required. Each student must have their own calculator. You really have to practice these keystrokes. And you'll need your calculator for your assessments, and you will not be able to share calculators during assessment. Technical detail is one of the things that we assess here in our stats course. The technical component is an important part of what it is we teach. I want to review a couple of definitions and issues before we get started in our example. First, a measure of center is a representative value for an entire population or sample, and it has clear notation, correct rounding, and the correct units involved. Presentation is an important component of any statistics course. The measures of center include the mean, the median, the mid-range, and the mode. You should have already viewed the PowerPoints for section 3.1 and read the text, so you'll have your definitions handy for those items. I also want to review the round-off rules. These round-off rules really do not change throughout the semester. They come up a number of different times, which is why I think students tend to get a little bit confused. But at the end of the day, they really don't change too much. There's a couple of exceptions, but they're really standouts. For the mean, the median, and the mid-range, we always carry one more decimal place than the data itself includes. We'll see that in action in just a moment. On the other hand, the mode, because of its definition, has no rounding rule attached to it. It's more like a vote. What data point was the most common? Who won the election, so to speak? First example, data entry. Let's get the data into our calculator so we can manipulate it. I like real world examples. So here we have a random sample of the number of months patients might wait to receive a transplant. We have a sample there, and the first thing to do is to get it into our calculator. I'm going to run through the keystrokes. We're going to take care of that. Now, you're going to enter your data into a number of different places on your calculator. We usually use the list built into your calculator, the list functionality. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I come over here to my calculator and I select the stat key, remember, your calculator really does want you to do good in this course. The first option, edit, is the one we'll use. So I'll hit enter. And this brings me to my list home. Now, if you've used Excel, this is very, very similar to the spreadsheet in Excel. You have rows and you have columns. You have a total of 6 columns altogether, and I think up to 999 rows. Fortunately, we don't need all of them for this example. I think we only need the first 11. Most of the time, your calculator will already have values occupying various lists. You'll need to clear those out. So the first thing I want to run through is how do we clear a list that's already present on your calculator. So take a look at it. I've got a list 1 So the way we're going to clear that list 1 is to highlight the list. Notice I use my up key to get the L1 to be highlighted. At that point, I can select clear, followed by enter, and the list goes away. Now I can go ahead and enter in the values in my list. A couple of things about entering in these values. We do not have a negative value in this list, but if we did have a negative value, I would plug in the negative that way. I would not use the subtraction operation over here. If you make an error, like I just did there in that example, I can scroll back up and hit the value and plug that in. I can use my keyboard and get all these values in. So we got a 7, 9, 12, 9 again, 7, 11, and 9 brings us back. So I'll use that stat key to clear my existing lists and enter in the data values. I also like to check for data entry errors. So if I'm going to make a mistake, chances are it's going to be here. Maybe I typed in 21 instead of 12. Anything like that could happen. Honestly, I'm just human. So if I jump back over here, I can scroll through my list and check, and I usually like to do that also. So I'll come back over here, 9, 11, 7, 12, 9, 7 again, 10, 3, 4. The last one should be a 5, and there we go. Notice down here, list 1, entry 1, list 2, entry 2, and so on and so forth. All right, so we've checked our data for entry. It's all in there. It lives in list 1. I'll need to know where that data is because I've got to point my calculator to the data list. There's a lot of places my data might live. Let's make sure it chews on the correct numbers. Once we do that, we can call forth the power of the TI-84. So let's now use the one variable stats command to get the jobs done for us that we'll need doing. We're going to use the same data. It's already in my calculator, so I might as well use that. It's repeated there for your convenience, and we're going to find the mean, the median, the mid-range, and the mode. So let me come back over here, select my stat key again, and this time I'll scroll over to calc. I'm going to want the one variable stat option. I can select other options by scrolling down if I need them, but to be truthful, we really use the first command here more than any other, almost to the exclusion of all those others that you see. So I'll say enter. That brings up that command. Now, there's a couple of different ways your calculator might be set up. My calculator currently is set up in such a way that we've got the stat wizard turned on. I see down here the stat wizard right here is on. I'm going to turn him off. Scrolling down using my arrow key, hit enter, and there we go. He's now turned off. So if I go back to stat, back to calculate, hit enter, one variable stats. So this is the way I'd like my screen to look. You can use it the other way, but it's much more functional in this fashion. Now, I need to point this command at the proper numbers. Those numbers live in list 1. There's a number of lists to choose from. How do I specify the list? If I take a close look at my keyboard, the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In fact, let me go ahead and really highlight that down here. These keys here, you'll notice in blue, we have L1, L2, L3, 4, 5, and 6 respectively. So I'll access that by selecting the second key. I get a little up arrow to indicate that. Then I can select the 1 key and I'll get list 1. At that point, all the hard work is done. I'll select enter and I'll just get a I think the technical term is a buttload of data. So there's a whole bunch of it right there. And that's going to contain most, not all, of the measures that we need. Now, if I come back over here, I'll note that I was asked to find the mean. The very first value up here is x with a little bar on it. I remind people that proper notation is important. So when I find a sample mean, I'll notate that with the x bar I see there. So 7.8 months. Why did I take just one decimal place? My data over here has no decimal places at all. I want one more than I see in my data. Notice the 9 here, no decimal places. One more than the data itself, right there. If I come back over to my calculator, I see a little down arrow. That means that there is more to be seen and notated here in our example. On the second screen, I'll see the minimum. I'll talk about some of this other stuff a little bit later, and the maximum value, but halfway between, not halfway, I'm sorry, in the middle, let's call it that, we have the median of 9 units. So coming back over here, I'll note that my median is 9.0 months. And again, we have the rounding. And at this point, I'll emphasize that each one of these numbers now has the units. The mid-range is the value halfway between the little guy and the big guy. That value is not on here. It is not the median. Do not get that confused with the median. It has a formula. I'll have to add the small and the large value, the min and the max, and divide the result by 2. If I come back over here to my calculator, I'll clear off that screen. 12 plus 3. Enter that, and I'll divide the result by 2. Remember, you have order of operations issues on this problem. It's important that you input the calculation correctly. Now, if I jump back over here, I'll see that we have a mid-range of 7.5 months. The last measure of center is the mode. There are keystrokes that can find the mode for you. However, our data sets are small enough to be easily manipulated on the personal level. How do I tell students to look and find the mode? Literally, to do that, to look at the data set. If I look at my data, for example, I see that there are 2 number 7s. So perhaps the mode is 7. Remember, the mode is the most common data value. However, I note that there are 3 values of 9. So my mode, 9 months. And you'll notice that we didn't use the rounding rule for the mode. The mode is more like reporting out who won an election. Most common data value in that data set, 9. So the mode for this data set is 9 months. So that runs you through the very basics of the keystrokes needed to get started on your Chapter 3 material. I'll have more of these as we go through the chapters, and we'll post them in the Canvas shell. In summary, we've learned how to enter sample data. You've got access now to your lists. We learned how to use the one variable stats command, pointing it at a specific list. And we've identified those various measures of center that we've pulled either directly from the output of the one variable stats command or used it to determine the values that we need. That brings me to the end of this presentation. I'm going to jump back to the other screen. I'll stop my sharing before I overshare. And I'll thank you for watching. I'll have you go away now and try some of those keystrokes. I'll also point out before I leave that all these keystrokes are presented in your text directly preceding the homework set. So look in your text, wherever each of those homework sets starts, your author does quite the good job of describing your TI-84 keystrokes that you need to do these types of problems. Thank you and goodbye.